In this episode, we talk about the United States and the European Union's latest sanctions on Russia and what they could mean for India's oil imports and energy strategy. We also talk about why Bihar's Prashant Kishore has received a notice from the Election Commission just a day after a report by the Indian Express. But first, we talk about the Election Commission's Special Intensive Revision, what it aims to fix about the voter lists, and how it differs from the exercise that took place in Bihar recently. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Starting the 4th of November, voters across 12 states and union territories will take part in the Election Commission's Special Intensive Revision or SIR. This exercise will account for nearly half of India's close to 1 billion registered electors and will cover Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Chhattisgarh, Goa, Gujarat, Kerala, Lakshadweep, Madhya Pradesh, Puducherry, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal. Now this of course will be the second phase of the SIR, following the first one held earlier this year in Bihar, which had caused widespread confusion and panic. However, this time the Election Commission has introduced several changes in an effort to make the process more inclusive and to ensure that voters can enroll more easily. To explain these changes, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Chief of National Bureau, Ritika Chopra.
Ritika, can you remind our listeners what is the reason the EC is conducting this exercise?
The main reason, of course, is that an intensive revision of the country's electoral rolls has not happened in over 2 decades. The last time this happened was between the years of 2001 and 2005. And again, like I said, it's been some time. So this exercise, according to the Election Commission, was long due. Another reason, of course, is that lately, at least in the last year and a half, many political parties have flagged problems with the electoral roll. The electoral roll isn't, or rather can never be pure in its state. There will always be anomalies, but lately political parties have been pointing out some very glaring problems in the electoral roll. Again, so in order to correct that, the Commission feels that a revision only of an intensive nature can actually solve this problem that has been repeatedly flagged by political parties who are key stakeholders in the electoral process. The third reason, of course, not always officially cited as a reason, but the fact that the Commission in the past has invoked that as a central test to being a voter in the country. One, of course, is the age criteria. You have to be 18 or above that. And second, that only citizens, Indian citizens, are allowed to vote in elections in India. So the Commission also feels that an intensive revision would allow it to check for the eligibility criteria, mainly the citizenship check as well.
And every year around January, the Election Commission had anyway been conducting their summary revisions, right? Aren't those enough to resolve these issues?
So the revision of the electoral roll are of different kinds. One is, of course, the summary revision that you mentioned, and which actually happens annually every year. It starts towards the fag end of a year, and the new electoral roll based on a summary revision is published in January every year. That sort of is an annual occurrence, but a rare occurrence, if I can call it that, or a less frequent one, is the intensive revision, which, of course, like I said, the Commission has undertaken now. But the intensive revision essentially means sort of a fresh preparation of the electoral roll, by way of a house-to-house survey. Summary revision में क्या होता है कि you publish the existing electoral roll and then invite people to come check for their details and maybe flag any mistakes. So basically changes are made to the existing roll. In the intensive roll, what will happen is that the Commission is, at least by definition, it's trying to prepare an electoral roll from scratch. So the latter, the intensive exercise, is meant to be, it's built into the name of the exercise. It's more intensive, meant to be a more thorough exercise as opposed to the summary revision, which essentially kind of is mainly an exercise in which you're updating the existing role and not essentially building a role from scratch.
And in the case of Bihar, of course, this exercise had created a lot of controversy because voters were asked to provide documents proving their age and citizenship to stay on the electoral rolls. And this turned out to be a very cumbersome process because, at least initially, the EC was not accepting Aadhaar cards, ration cards, and even its own Epic cards. So talk about how the pan-India SIR will be different from what we saw take place in Bihar.
So the Bihar exercise, as you've rightly mentioned, initially took off on this very confusing note. It's not just the electorate. It seemed like a huge part of the election machinery was also taken by surprise because an exercise of that scale, like we've discussed, it's an intensive exercise of that scale, was announced out of the blue with very little time for preparation for the election machinery. And what complicated things further, at least for the field officers of the commission, was that this exercise, unlike the past intensive revisions of the electoral roll, was very different in its methodology. So the commission is well within its right to tweak the methodology. There is nothing wrong with that. But this time around, like I mentioned earlier, the commission did impress upon its right to check for citizenship, which was never built into the past exercises because the commission has always, at least traditionally, been of the view that it's not its remit to check for citizenship. It's the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is the right authority to do that. But yes, while including or excluding, or while even during a summary revision, intensive revision, if it came across cases of non-citizens, it had the right to exclude those names. But in this exercise, the instructions to officers were explicit that you have to check for citizenship too. And how do you do that? In order to do that, a predetermined list of documents was shared with officers. This was essentially a list of 11 documents. And like I said, that there was very little time for preparation, not just for the field officers of the commission, but frankly, in a very short span of time, the electorate of Bihar was expected to have these documents at their disposal. As we know, and as Express has reported during its very detailed coverage of the Bihar exercise, that the coverage of documents in Bihar has been traditionally poor, and there was this mad scramble for documents in Bihar, at least in the first 2 weeks of the exercise, right after it kicked off in Bihar.
Right, this is something that a colleague Santosh Singh had reported on. There was a lot of lack of awareness. Thousands of people were scrambling to get their documents in order. There were long queues at Xerox shops and internet cafes where the internet was terribly slow. And all this was a nightmare for booth level workers who had to ensure that this gets done in a very short span of time. And there was a certain section of the population, women especially, it was very tough for them to get documents. And a lot of people from the marginalized communities, they faced a lot of problems.
Right. In fact, so that eventually turned out to be a huge criticism of the exercise that, the commission has always tried to be very inclusive when it comes to preparation of the electoral roll. This exercise, on the other hand, seems very exclusive. But I think at some point, even as the commission officials and the electorate was trying to wrap its head around this exercise, how do they ensure that maximum number of voters are included as opposed to excluding a large number of voters? I think eventually at some point, by way of intervention of the Supreme Court, and it took note of feedback from its officers on the ground, the commission did eventually tweak the process as it went along. And from initially being sort of seeming like a citizenship check, exclusionary in nature, from being a very rigid exercise, it kind of, I think, over a period of time, the commission did accommodate more concerns, tried to address those concerns. And by the end of it, especially after the Supreme Court asked the EC to include Aadhaar as one of the documents, which has a considerable amount of coverage in the state, the exercise eventually became inclusive.
Yeah, and considering all this, tell us what changes have been made to the SIR now. Tell us, what will we see take place in these 12 states and union territories?
Yeah. So there are actually some very distinct departures from the Bihar exercise. And like I said, that this, of course, is lessons from Bihar, which are now reflecting in the second phase of the SIR, which has been rolled out in 12 states. The biggest difference or the biggest shift is right at the starting line during the enumeration phase. This is the first stage of the SIR exercise, where BLOs are going from door to door, trying to verify particulars of existing voters. In this stage, which actually had triggered so much, if you remember, anxiety in Bihar, what the commission is now saying is that at this stage, I will just focus on verifying the details of the existing voters by way of an enumeration form. In fact, the enumeration form of Bihar and the enumeration form now looks very different. The current enumeration form has an additional, or rather 2 additional columns by which you have to trace either your presence back to the last electoral roll prepared on the last special intensive exercise in your state, or trace back the presence of either of your parents, both parents, or even a relative for that matter, to the last electoral roll prepared based on the last intensive revision exercise in your state. And this stage, the commission is saying, I do not want any documents from you. This stage is just focused on existing electors, verifying their details because they are pre-printed details of the existing electors on the form. And at the same time, you have to try your best to link yourself to the last electoral roll. And if you're able to do that, then you don't have to submit any documents. Only those who are not able to link themselves to the last electoral roll, frankly, of any state for that matter. If you remember in Bihar, only if you were able to find your name or your parents' name in the last 2003 electoral roll of just Bihar were you included in the final roll published in Bihar. But now, for instance, this is just an example, but both West Bengal and Tamil Nadu are part of this second phase. If I am working in Chennai, but I was born and raised in Kolkata, and I was earlier registered as a voter in Kolkata, and now I've moved to Chennai. So if I can find my name registered in the 2002 electoral roll of West Bengal when the SIR last happened there, and submitted it here in Chennai to the BLO, that is also good enough to include me in the final roll.
So in this particular example that you talked about, one imagines that it would make it a lot easier for migrant workers, because that was another problem that people in Bihar had faced.
Yes. This actually takes care of that. I still expect some teething issues in the sense that, the electoral roll back then wasn't, there are scanned copies of it, but there is no electronic form in the sense that there are so many people with the same name, in fact, even same parents' name. So how will the commission try and differentiate one from another, given that there might be multiple claims to one specific entry in an electoral roll? That remains to be seen. But for now, again, at the starting line, this exercise seems to be very different from what the commission had announced on the 24th of June for Bihar.
Okay, so one difference that you mentioned was that initially, at least, there would be no need to provide any documentation. Through that initial enumeration form, you will just have to trace your link to the last revision which took place. And this time, you won't have to worry as much if you have shifted to another place. What are some other changes that we will see in this process now?
The other change, of course, is that, the submission of documents is required only for those who did not feature in any of the state's electoral rolls. So, but that submission of documents has been moved to the second stage, that is after the draft roll is published on this 9th of December. And also, while this is not part of the instructions per se, but going by the tone of the Chief Election Commissioner in the press conference yesterday, it seemed like the Commission's tone on the citizenship checks has softened to a great extent. Because earlier, even while the petition was being heard in the Supreme Court challenging the Bihar exercise, the Commission was consistently, invoking that citizenship is a very important eligibility criteria and kept invoking it as a central test. We didn't get that sense yesterday. So there's that change in its tone and tenor of the top EC officers, of course.
Right. This was the reason that a lot of opposition parties had compared what was happening in Bihar to the NRC.
So that was the biggest concern, and the opposition did call Bihar SIR, at least dubbed the Bihar SIR exercise as a NRC buyback tour. They did dub it as that because there was a huge concern that, there could be an effort to disenfranchise people of a specific community as well. But like I said, that, when it comes to documentation, Bihar as a state doesn't really do that well. And of course, there are people from disadvantaged communities, many especially from the Muslim community, who would not have those documents. So there was this concern and fear that it could lead to disproportionate deletion of people from the Muslim community, or especially of Muslim voters, and which is why the opposition did call this sort of an NRC by backdoor exercise. And also just two minor procedural changes. One, of course, is that, earlier, aside from the fact that the existing voters had to prove their eligibility to remain on the roll, what about the new voters who still want to be included for the first time in the electoral roll? Their forms were only being collected towards the end of the Bihar SIR exercise. Now they can submit their Form 6 in the enumeration phase itself, in the first stage itself. And lastly, one big criticism, like I said right in the beginning, was that, the announcement came as a surprise to the political parties, to the electorate, and to a large part to its officers on the ground also. And political parties, which are key stakeholders in the electoral process, felt that they weren't briefed about it, which is why, quite rightly so, they had their apprehensions about this exercise. But this time, the commission has instructed its chief electoral officers in the 12 states and UTs to hold multiple meetings with political parties to explain the process in detail, so that they are also involved in the process and they can assist the voters in the SIR drive. This, at least on the face of it for now, seems like the commission will be consulting parties, will be taking their feedback and briefing them in detail about the exercise, which was practically absent during the Bihar exercise. It happened much later when the parties had become bitter critics of the Bihar exercise, but they're trying to do this at the beginning.
And now, moving from domestic concerns, we shift our attention to the United States and the European Union, which have imposed their most aggressive sanctions yet on Russia, targeting its two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and striking at the core of Moscow's war economy.
Well, US, ever since Trump came to power in office in January this year.
This is the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor, Shubhajit Roy.
One of his key agenda themes has been to stop the Russia-Ukraine war. He had famously said that he can stop the war on day one itself. And now he has been trying to negotiate between the two countries, two sides. On the other hand, the European leaders have also rallied around Zelensky and supported him and leaned in favor of Zelensky so that the US president doesn't abandon Ukraine at this time of the war.
He points out that it's now been about 3.5 years since Russia first invaded Ukraine, and the conflict has reached a kind of deadlock.
So the US President Trump, he has been trying to put pressure on Russia now, having realized belatedly that the Russian side is not going to yield and vacate and stop the war, vacate the occupied territory and stop the war. In fact, the Russian President Putin, he has put forward newer demands beyond what they have already captured. So in this context, he has now moved towards putting pressure on Russia. And in that context, he wants to choke off the Russian war machine. And to do that, he has targeted its energy capacity, because Russia is a huge exporter of energy, oil and gas both. So by sanctioning these Russian companies, which have been exporting energy outside of Russia to China, to India, and to other countries, it has now, which finally made its way to Europe, it has now tried to choke and close the tap and put pressure on Russia, because if Russia's income goes down because of these sanctions, then the expectation is that it will come to the negotiating table. So that is the sort of background in which the American president, American administration under President Trump has put sanctions, these latest sanctions, which are the most aggressive sanctions in the last 9 months since he came to office.
But as Washington and Brussels tighten the noose, the ripple effects are being felt thousands of miles away in New Delhi. For India, this move comes at a critical point. Over the past 2 years, Russia has gone from being a marginal supplier to one of India's top sources of crude oil. So, to understand what these new sanctions mean for India's energy policy and how India plans to recalibrate its imports, we speak to Shubhajit in this segment. Shubhajit, for India, which sources nearly a third of its crude oil from Russia, how do these fresh sanctions affect its import strategy?
So, as you know, Ichha, since February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was this sort of fear that the oil prices in the world would go up, because if the Russian oil is not bought by Europe and the US, then there will be suddenly a demand supply gap, and that would push the prices upwards. So India and China, they emerged as the biggest buyers of Russian energy. In fact, for India, just to give context, out of the entire import basket of energy, Russia was less than 2% in as in February 2022. But today, I mean, as of August, it was to the tune of 32 to 33%. That is almost one third of India's energy imports were coming from Russia because of the discounts that Russia was giving to India to sell its energy. So India benefited from that price cap and was able to, stabilize the global energy supply market. That is number one. But more importantly, for the domestic consumers in India, the prices of energy did not go up significantly or substantially after the war. And that sort of was the essential strategy to cushion the inflationary impact of energy prices on Indian consumers, was the stated objective from the Indian government. And so now, if these companies which export Russian oil, these Russian oil companies, if they are sanctioned, then India will not be able to buy the oil at the same amount, at the same price as before. So that directly impacts India's sort of energy security and its oil imports from Russia. So that's why they have a bearing and an impact on India's energy imports.
And so these sanctions, it does put India in a triple bind, right? Like where it sort of has to balance ties with the US, EU, and Russia all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. As you remember, the US President Trump, he has put about 25% tariffs on India as a penalty for buying Russian oil. And these tariffs came into effect in August this year, which put the total tariffs at 50%. And that's the highest bracket of tariffs that US has put on any country. India and Brazil are at the highest slot, obviously for different reasons. But for India, that has been a big challenge that has put a strain in the bilateral relationship with the United States. And now it is being forced, in a sense, by the US to abandon this idea of, or this strategy of buying Russian oil at discounted prices, because that cost advantage has suddenly evaporated. So in that context, the Indian side, Indian government has found itself in a tight spot where it has friends and partners on both sides, as strategic partners on both sides, and it has to now take a decision based on its own national interests. Essentially, how does it keep the prices for your domestic consumers intact and not get that should not rise, but at the same time maintain its strategic autonomy, its strategic independence. So I think that has become the bigger challenge for India at this point of time, as well as, obviously, you rightly pointed out, balancing ties between India, US and India, Russia.
And Shubhajit, will India now have to diversify back toward Middle Eastern suppliers? And also, what kind of cost or risk does that bring?
Yeah, so as you know, India imports 80 to 85% of its needs from external sources. So Gulf and Middle East has been the traditional sort of suppliers. Almost, I think, 65% of India's energy comes from Gulf and Middle East. Now, it is obviously, if the Russian sources are drying up, then it has to look at other alternative sources. In that sense, it will obviously fall back on its friends and partners in West Asia, in Middle East, in Gulf, but also it might have to buy a bit of more oil or energy from the US as well, because US is also turned to be a net exporter of energy in the last few years. And the US president has also asked India to buy energy from itself. So I think it will be a shift away from Russia, maybe not zero out completely, but it would definitely be much lesser than what it has been buying. And it will look at Middle East, West Asia, its traditional suppliers, plus some newer partners like the United States of America.
And lastly, Shubhajit, how will this situation restructure the global oil order that way? Like in terms of pricing benchmarks or even alliances for that matter in energy trade?
So we'll have to see, Ichha, how does that play out? How much oil, if once the Russian oil is frozen out by India, that excess oil, what it does, and is there a demand supply gap? Does that mean what happens to the oil prices? How much can US supply? How much can the rest of the world bridge the supply gap? If not, there would be a danger of higher energy prices. And that is something that is the area where Indians would be looking at closely, because that would mean higher prices. And once higher energy prices come into play, because India is so dependent on energy imports, then it puts pressure on India's economy, because then the commodity prices, food prices, everything goes up because of higher input costs in terms of energy.
And in the end, we talk about politician and former political strategist Prashant Kishore, whose Jan Suraj is contesting in the upcoming Bihar elections. Yesterday, Kishore received a notice from the Election Commission a day after the Indian Express's Santosh Singh reported that his name appears in voter lists in both West Bengal and Bihar. Citing the Indian Express's Santosh Singh, the notice was signed by the Sasaram Land Revenue Deputy Collector and Electoral Officer of Kargahar, and it asks Kishore to respond within 3 days. The notice refers to Section 17 of the Representation of the People Act 1950, which states that no person shall be registered as a voter in more than one constituency. It also cites Section 31 of the same Act, which prescribes a punishment of up to 1 year's imprisonment, a fine, or both for violations. The controversy stems from the Indian Express report that Kishore's name remains in both Bhabanipur, West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee's constituency, and his native village of Konnar in Bihar's Rohtas district. Singh reported that in Bengal, his registered address is 121 Kalighat Road, the location of the Trinamool Congress office. Kishore worked as a political consultant for the party during the 2021 assembly elections, and his polling station there is listed as St. Helens School on B. Rani Shankari Lane. Meanwhile, in Bihar, he is registered as a voter under the Sasaram parliamentary constituency in the Kargahar assembly seat, with his polling station at Madhya Vidyalaya Konar. A senior member of Kishore's team told the Indian Express that he became a voter in Bihar after the 2021 Bengal polls, and that he had already applied to have his Bengal voter card cancelled. However, the team did not specify the status of that cancellation request. Kishore himself has not responded publicly to the notice or to earlier media queries. Singh highlights that cases of multiple voter registrations are not uncommon. The Election Commission has identified this issue as one of the main reasons for the ongoing special intensive revision across states. In its June 2025 order launching the SIR, the EC noted that some voters register in new locations without deleting old entries, leading to duplication. You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.